Hi, have you ever wanted to make really strange percussive loops that have fun rhythms and can be processed in many different ways? My name is Very Human, and in this video, I'm going to show you how. What I'm about to show you is a twofold method. I use both methods, whether that be just the sampler method I show or just a drum rack. In the drum rack, you can put effects on each pad. It's pretty cool. I'd mess around with both of these or put samplers in your drum rack like I do in this video. So, let's get into it. My first method of creating this is the original method I learned, and I built a drum rack. Right here, as you can see, I have an audio effects rack with another audio effects rack inside of it. Each of these has different effects on each channel. Each one has an arpeggiator. These arpeggiators I went through and I set the rate to be something different. If you don't know how already, making a macro is pretty easy. Just right click the parameter that you want to set as a macro in your audio effect group. Click add to the macro that you want. I chose 4 over here for this rate. Go back over to your group and there you go. That way, let's say we play something here real quick. It's pretty cool, and it's really fun. It's not too hard to set up, so let's go over it. First off, you get a drum rack, and you load in 1 rack space worth of sounds that you want, whether that be cymbals, or as you see, I have all these strange bell sounds that I just grabbed and threw in there. The next step that I did was I threw an arpeggiator on there, and I mapped the rate over here to my synced rate knob. And I did this for each of these samples at something different, at least as the starting point and the end point of the map. So if you go over here and you want to go to macro map, you can see here that once I set this, went in and gave it a different starting point on each one. That way, when they're played together and I play with this sync rate knob, you can get rhythm combinations that, like I said earlier, you wouldn't, or I wouldn't get if I was just trying to come up with it on the fly. So the next step that I did was go through and process it. I added more things to my rack. I have LFOs. I have these going at samplers that I've thrown in these. This will walk through each of the chains that I have. I have this in another audio effect rack or group, and each one is an individual sampler. This is kind of the crazy way to do it. The original way, where I just put the samples in one drum rack, gets me where I want to be, but this was kind of my going overboard when I was making this at first, and I appreciate it. Sometimes it's nice to go overboard when you're making music. But in each one of these, I have a different bell sound from Ableton. These are just stock Ableton sounds that I threw in. Cool, so that's without the processing. That's what the sound sounds like as it goes through this sampler group, basically. So each one of these is a sampler. And this is the next method. So if you do want to take it to the next level, or you don't feel like using a drum rack, you can do this and get the same sort of result. With each one being a sampler, I have it set, tuned how I like it, and I set up an LFO, and I have that set over to my chain selector. How I went about doing this is, once you've thrown in the sampler, the first sound that you want as a sampler, you then group it, Command G, or Control G if you're on PC. And from there, you can do another 127 sounds. Over in this group, you can go over to the chain. So you can see this is what the LFO is doing. It's pulling that across. Once you've dropped these in, these will all be extended out. So you highlight them all with Control or Command A, and you click this right here, distribute ranges equally. This does what's going on right here, and that distributes each of these over a space up to 128 total spaces that you can do depending on how many samples you have. With this LFO, I set the rate. You can do this to truly whatever you want, and I set it over to this chain selector knob that I mapped to the group. From there, it steps through each of these sounds. As you can see, it jumps across. You can change this rate from anything to super fast or very, very creepy slow. I find that that is a cool way to get hi-hat loops just generated for you. So you can put a bunch of different hi-hats in there, and if you have your LFO set slow in this method, just keep that playing for however long this is, 10 minutes. Make a MIDI track, and if you were to just play this, because of that arpeggiator, I am able to just have it at one note, and it will go through the rhythm that I want through the entire sampler collection. This is really fun when you start making just random notes over here. So I'm just gonna start dragging. I'm gonna do it. Boom. So if I were to play this one more time and mess around with the sync rate knob, you'll hear that we get all kinds of strange rhythms. So now on to how I like to process my sounds, and this is how I get more of that experimental trap, that s280f, Iglooghost, GECS View, Spoke to God sort of sound. This is taught to me actually by MDX View back in the early months of this year, so huge shout out and thank you again. Basically, I have all of my favorite effects. We have the corpus, like I explained through in the last video. I have 2 of them. This top one is going to be my more tinky sound, that's with the beam. I have that tuned to C because the way I work is I bounce these out on audio right here and I save them away. So that way I can use them and I have a pretty good idea of where it's tuned depending on what I'm working with. The next is my tube corpus. That kind of gives me more of that low end bassy metallic resonance, like I explained in the last video, but didn't show the best examples, I'm sorry. Play around with the dry wet and the gain of each of these. I find that when the gain is all the way up or 0 on these, I lose a lot of the plink, the tink, the attack. But if I set this back down to how I'd had it, you still get the resonance, but you don't lose the punch at the front, which I personally like for my percussive sounds. When I'm using these types of sounds in my production, the whole point is to get these punchy, fast rhythms. From there, I EQ just a little bit. This is flat at the moment because these sounds are more high-end oriented, but if you have some processing that gives you a lot of bass or something like that, you can give yourself a low cut, you can boost the highs, just make sure you're not clipping too hard, unless you want that. Break the rules if you want to, I'll always say that. Next step is this metallic sounds rack. That's an older version of rack that I showed off in the last video. Originally it was going into a spectral time, which is another wonderful delay, and I can go over that in another video, but I like the grain delay more. This gives you all those particles. It also allows you to get different elements to the pitch. You can add some sort of high-end spraying particles or these low-end like clunks. So without, you can really hear the corpus combo that I have going on there, more so with that grain delay off. So now with it on, all those low-endy sounds come from this grain delay. I basically have each one of these mapped over, and when I play with the pitcher knob right here, I can get all those fragments to come off of it. Keep in mind, this really depends how you map each macro. This macro is all of these sent to 1 at different variables. So if we go to my edit macro map for this, I have each one of these. I fine-tuned it to what I wanted for this rack. I suggest playing with each of these parameters, what your top parameter is going to be and your bottom parameter. It's going to give you different tones depending on what you're doing with the knob. After that, I have a Redux. It's a bit crusher. It's Ableton's bit crusher. I really like it personally. If you reduce the bits and keep the rate high, you get a lot more of that dirt that I actually like. We like dirt. It's not that I dislike the noise or the actual bit crushing of this rate right here, but Ableton's new Redux is awesome. That separate bits section is entirely what I love. I throw it on basses, I throw it on vocals sometimes, I do it on the whole track sometimes, because it's nice, it's messed up. Next, I have Dank Sauce's Fine Tune macro. Wonderful little tuner. I got this from Dank Sauce in his packs. Definitely check out his Gumroad. I use a lot of it. I've learned a lot from it by deconstructing these racks and really understanding what goes into each of these. This is just a shifter. This allows me to dial in my tuning. It's not perfect, it's no auto-tune, it's not like working with a synth where you really can get your sine wave to be exactly at C. This is more based off of 1, your ear, and 2, you can use Ableton's tuner, which is just an audio effect over here. And as you can see, sometimes you don't get to see what it's tuning to because it's not giving enough of a tail or a solid tone for it to even show up here. This is something I find to be an issue with a lot of these metallic tonal sounds, especially with percussion, because of that sort of pitch envelope aspect to these hits. It's the nature of them, it's how they work. All is said and done, I'm going to make another audio track. And then I'm going to set stereo in over to my drum rack. That's this channel right here. Once that's set up, I can go over, I can set up the record, and I would record that out. I would do that while playing around with each of these knobs. When we take a look at some of the automation, I've written in just a bunch over the course of 10 minutes. And as it goes through that sampler or your drum rack or whatever you've written inside of your drum rack like this, you'll get something different as you play through the different knobs. So with the synced rate, if I were to go and start down here, let's say, and you can get a lot of stuff, and then we'll go directly to this audio channel. Once you've recorded, you can then take your audio clip. I like to Command J, consolidate that. Pardon me, I burped. Then I will show in my browser, and then I'll take you over to where you can see your consolidations, all the audio files that it saves to be able to reference back later. From there, you can rename, boom. And in Ableton, they make it really cool to just add folders, so that way you can easily drag and drop from their browser, from your consolidation folder, into whichever folder you want. So if you were to, for example, with this, have about 10 minutes straight of arpeggiation played, messed with, and experimented with based on this rack, you can get yourself 10 minutes of crazy sounds, and you consolidate at each point that you would like your loop to end. If you're like me and you do too much at once, you're stuck with this huge folder of sounds and you probably won't use them all. There's a lot you can do with this, and this is a great technique that should be messed around with. Play with the sounds that you throw into either your drum rack or your sampler, and play with the LFO rates that you're using to automate different parameters. Automate everything. I think that's just kind of a golden rule at this point with digital music production, especially with electronic music, but play with the parameters. Start seeing what your limiting parameters are with each macro that you build, because those little details are going to make it so much easier for you to quickly get crazy sounds. I hope this video is helpful in some way. This was a life changer for me. I use these types of sounds and loops that I've made in just about every track. Hope you enjoy. My name is Very Human. This has been another Subnet Cloud Party Ableton Live 12 tutorial. I also hope that these audio examples were a little bit better. I am so sorry about that. I got nervous.